All right, this is Libertarian Overwatch, and today we're introducing Kit Klarenberg from the Gray Zone UK. And as I've always said, one of the absolute best at documenting the color revolutions. Kit, how are we doing this morning?
Good. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So today we're going to kind of cover some more recent color revolutions and things like that. And today we're kind of looking at Nepal as a good starting point, where we've had quite a few great articles about that, especially like a color revolution in Nepal, where we talk about kind of this rapid escalation where we're going from, emerging these large scale protests and ultimately kind of that leadership transition. So could you walk us a little bit through how we saw that sequence kind of unfold and like where the situation currently stands in Nepal?
Yeah, sure. So I think Nepal's very interesting, and it's something that cropped up on my radar very quickly because it actually became a kind of point of contention and discussion between independent journalists and academics and geopolitical commentators, for want of a better term, over whether this was legitimate, over whether this was organic, etc. And I must admit, I didn't know masses about Nepal prior to this happening, but I've become an expert in the 8 months or so since it happened. So in September 2025. There were these vast protests that kind of engulfed Nepal. There were a large number of public and private buildings that were set ablaze. There were the homes and offices of government ministers and political parties were torched, and there were high-ranking ministers had to flee via helicopter. The Prime Minister of Nepal, KP Sharma Oli, he resigned. The Western media was all over this, branding it spontaneous upheaval by pissed off Gen Z activists, and there was a lot of talk about official corruption, unemployment, worsening economic conditions, and also censorship of social media, if not the wider internet. And that this was cited as the casus belli for all of these. For all these protesters. Very, very quickly looking into this, I saw a number of data points which were pretty alarming, I would say, and worthy of further inquiry and digging. And since then, we at the Grey Zone have received a kind of fairly steady stream of leaks from the National Endowment of Democracy and USAID, showing that this was in every way not spontaneous, not organic, but was a very, very classic and brilliantly executed from a operational standpoint color revolution. I mean, the protests were led by this rather obscure, or hitherto obscure, NGO called Hami Nepal, which was set up to distribute aid during COVID. It also works with the victims of earthquakes, which are not uncommon in Nepal. It's rather barren, mountainous landscape. There's not really masses there, and funnily enough, it was never formally incorporated into China or the British Empire. It was allowed to exist as this independent speck of land between India and China for many centuries. But the fact of the matter is Nepal it still has a population of 30 million people, and I thought the fact that this NGO Hami Nepal playing this outside role in setting up a hotline for protesters, for establishing platforms for organizing, the fact that they could take down a government in a few days, that really gave me pause. And I think just based purely on open sources, it's very, very clear that Hami Nepal is in receipt of funds, whether directly or indirectly, from wealthy local oligarchs, but also Western foundations and aid organizations, but also bizarrely Viber, which is this Israeli-created messaging app, Coca-Cola, which is rather notorious for its complicity in human rights abuses in the global south. And there's also it's also tied to the Gurkha Welfare Trust, which is in the Gurkhas, this elite fighting force within the British Army who've fought alongside the British for centuries and are often tasked with kind of sensitive special forces missions. The trust provides financial aid to Gurkha veterans and their widows and families, and it's financed by the British Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defence, which is potentially suspect. But yeah, and there are other aspects here too that really jumped out to me. Is the fact that I stated, from an operational standpoint, this was flawlessly executed. People committed very serious crimes. Now, the full scale of that was not clear, but based on the pictures that emerged alone, I mean, there was all of these government buildings on fire, and all of all of this unrest in the streets and violent clashes between the security forces and protesters. Now, markedly, the military stepped in at the end of this and started negotiating over the shape of the future government and future Nepal with the Gen Z protesters, i.e. the individuals who'd been organizing and directed via Hami Nepal. And interestingly, the military sites or say like barracks that were obviously tied to the military, in government buildings, were left alone by the arsonists. And it's really important to drive home here that this was very, very professional. So it was very selective. Clearly, the targets were chosen in advance, and to set these fires, security cameras were disabled, water tanks were emptied so they couldn't be put out. There were documents were burned, and also accelerants were added to the fires to make them burn quicker. That made what happened so much more dangerous. Now we fast forward to today, and no one involved in setting these fires is apparently under police investigation or is going to face any consequences for what they did. Whereas the now fallen senior officials within the coup government, they are all going to facing the prospect of landing in court on very serious charges for the heavy-handed response of security services and police to the unrest, which is this goes a lot deeper, and we'll get into it in due course. But yeah, the whole thing stank to high heaven. Now, in these leaks that we've received at the Grey Zone, it's very, very clear that for many years, the USAID and NED and the usual alphabet soup of US intelligence cutouts and Western foundations, which are always kind of core actors within color revolutions, they were specifically building an army of youth revolutionaries who could be deployed and were being trained to fight for their rights and do things like set up political parties, create NGOs, create campaign groups, etc. And they were in direct, this was all being directly coordinated and funded. Both wings of the NED, the National Democratic Institute and the International Republican Institute, and they openly talk about wanting to cultivate networks of young political activists who can quote unquote support US interests locally. And I would imagine that with the best will in the world to Americans, the average US citizen has never heard of Nepal before, right? Or might not be able to find it on the map, same as most Western citizens. And I think that it would be quite, for many Americans, I think it'd be quite alarming that their government is doing this and spending. We're talking about millions being spent over many years on these programs. Anyway, what makes this all all the more sinister is that Hami Nepal, we now know from the leaks, was funded and by the NED. This is specifically a product of the NED, and it's run by people who not only were at the forefront of the protest, but also were in some cases form the Nepal's new government. In these leaks, there are several people who are named as subjects of intense interest to the NED in creating this shadow chaos army on the streets of Nepal. And also these individuals, and they founded RSP, which is this new party, which when was it? A few months ago. Yeah, I think it was in was it March this year? There was finally an election in Nepal, and RSP won via landslide. It was this hitherto untested political force which swept away government ministers, including KP Sharma Oli, the former prime minister. They all lost their seats in parliament and were replaced by people who are openly named in leaked NED files as agents of influence for the endowment, but also just Washington more generally. And this includes Balan Shah, who's now the prime minister of Nepal, and is something of a Western media darling, because he was a very popular rapper and then became the mayor of Kathmandu, and he was at the forefront of the September 2025 unrest, and very much on the side of protesters. Now, interestingly, despite the fact that he was the mayor of Kathmandu at the time, and of course he had party offices and there were state offices within the capital, while Hamid Nepal's activists were setting fire to all these government buildings, all municipal buildings tied to Balan Shah's mayoralty were left alone, which is quite interesting. Several arson attacks that seem to have directly been the work of people who now form Nepal's government, or they somehow benefited members of Nepal's government, including there was the headquarters of a local media conglomerate called Kantapur, which had published negative stories about an individual called Rabi, I think it's Lamachan or Lamachain. He is again named as an agent of influence for NED. He's had a rather tempestuous history, because he was a very well-known local TV journalist, and then he entered politics, quickly became Nepal's deputy prime minister before being forced to resign because he was a US citizen, not a Nepali citizen, which is illegal under their constitution. And Kantapur exposed that. They got torched. So you do wonder whether this was an act of very personal revenge, etc. And it just goes on and on and on. And it's so, I mean, the leaks are very, 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 very revealing and contain all manner of excerpts, which is kind of your eyes kind of pop to see it just spelled out in black and white, and they specifically talk about the kind of issues that they want young Nepalis to campaign on, and that's unemployment and corruption. What were the rallying cries of? And these are of course very important issues, which people that it's entirely legitimate to be concerned about. But I think that the expectations are very, very high for this new government, which is yet being framed as this this Gen Z fraternity. Young Nepalis are taking control of their country. We've heard this a lot of times before. Indeed, in every color revolution in history, pretty much, we're told that the often violent insurrection that leads to the fall of governments that have fallen out of favor with the West is going to herald a new era of democracy and liberalism and progress, and then the end result is anything but that. And there's an enormous amount of buyer's remorse in every single case. And I think this is something that comes through in your work, Patrick, but it's something I try and nail as well, is that you cannot point, at least from say 2000 onwards with the bulldozer revolution in what was then Yugoslavia, and ever onwards, you can't point to a single example where a color revolution has brought a better government to power. Almost invariably, the governments that have been elected or seized power as a result of these soft civil society coups, they have been considerably worse. That people have gotten poorer. The state has become more repressive, not less. And real change, meaningful change, has not really materialized. And I've traveled around a number of countries, which again we can get into in greater detail. I've visited countries that have been victims of color revolutions, and I've seen the impact. Just once proud, harmonious, and developing nations have been set back decades by this stuff. I mean, a very common upshot is depopulation. Well, I mean, given that there are legitimate grievances that young Nepalis have about the way that they're governed and the state of their economy, I don't think the new government's actually going to deliver for them. I think what's much more likely is that they're probably just going to end up leaving. So Nepal will get the rainbow flags and it will get all the other emblems of progress, but actually, in real terms, it will be considerably more miserable. And I think that on this point as well, I mean, irrespective of what one thinks of China or Russia, I actually think that it is quite troublingly weak and short-sighted for Russia and China not to have done more to publicize the fact that Nepal, that the Nepali quote-unquote revolution was a US-sponsored coup. Because I mean, both China and Russia have been concerned, or at least have presented themselves publicly as being very concerned about the threat of color revolutions, to the extent that they have held conferences attended by countries from Central Asia and Eurasia, where they talk about the threats of US sponsored unrest, and they offer practical training in how to resist color revolution attempts. And then yet Nepal, which I would say based on open source material alone, was absolutely blatant, absolutely blatantly orchestrated by Washington. Both China and Russia were not only silent, but China very quickly effectively recognized the fact that there had been a violent coup in neighboring Kathmandu, and then raised no questions about what had happened. And then when the new government was elected, they signed off on it as legitimate and said, we look forward to working together. And I think that again, as we'll get into, in the modern world, I don't think that you can just sit idly by. I'm certainly not suggesting that China and Russia should necessarily engage in direct intervention to prevent this stuff happening. But I mean, at the very least, publicizing and condemning what's been done, because as I say, very serious crimes were committed, and the people who committed them now form the government, and the people who now form the government are Western assets. And China can expect in some of these leaks there are specifically references to how there needs to be a vibrant youth political scene in Nepal in order to further the US's Asia Pacific strategy. Well, I mean, the Asia Pacific strategy has nothing to do with young people's lives getting better in Asia. It has everything to do with encircling China with hostile military bases and governments who are opposed to the CPC, etc. And I think I know for a fact there are people within Central and Eastern Europe who think that, say, in Maidan, in Ukraine in 2014, another very blatant NED coup, that there should have been a direct intervention of some kind by Russia. That could have potentially prevented the virus from spreading. And indeed, it's often forgotten that, I mean, when you have the Maidan sniper massacre, which was absolutely blatant, false flag carried out by ultra-nationalist opposition elements, that was at a time when the protests had run out of steam. It was clearly decided that there needed to be bloodshed in order to inaugurate, in order to oust Yankovic and inaugurate this new Ukraine. That was a conscious decision that was made because the protests were kind of receding, by that stage. And again, in that context, in Nepal, clearly it was decided there needed to be immediate kind of violence directed against protesters in order to basically justify what they were doing. Very quickly, people associated with Hami Nepal sought to distance themselves from acts of arson or vandalism that were committed by protesters. And then yet, in the days leading up to the outbreak of protests, Hami Nepal's Discord server had bristled with all of these messages expressing violent intent, up to and including people stating they wanted to murder government ministers and their families. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary. It was, as I say, pulled off absolutely flawlessly and very, very effectively. And I think it's a very palpable demonstration of the fact that color revolutions, which the US used to openly boast about orchestrating abroad, that threat has gone nowhere. And so often that threat is a direct result of governments allowing organizations like the NED, or other intelligence cutouts or Western foundations to operate without very much in the way of oversight and impunity. And over and over again, when countries have opened themselves up to the West, the leaders in question who've been at the forefront of this, whether that's Edvard Shevardnadze, or others, they are basically signing their own death warrants by allowing the open society foundations to operate without very much in the way of oversight, and despite what they do being very obvious and indeed kind of openly admitted. And what's interesting as well is many countries have sought to follow Russia's. Russia banned NED and associated organizations from operating in Russia in 2015. A number of countries have followed suit, are looking to follow suit, and in many cases, the pushback against governments trying to implement foreign agent legislation, which is often very tame, and it just requires NGOs that are in receipt of in excess of a certain sum from abroad to publicly state that. And if these NGOs are specifically concerned with democracy promotion and construction, surely that's no problem. Ask yourself why Viktor Orban attempted to do this, and that made him a marked man, and he was explicitly overruled by Brussels when he attempted to implement the foreign agent law. Georgia, likewise, was brought to the point of violent revolution, with EU officials pretty much openly threatening the government that their lives were at risk if they went ahead and implemented foreign agent legislation. So quite clearly, this is something that the powers that be, who are not our friends and not the allies of people throughout wherever they are in the world, global south or otherwise, are very concerned about governments not doing this, and there's a reason for that.
Yeah. No, I think a couple of threads that you picked up on there are really important to stress too, talking about the color revolutions, where even if there is that genuine support, and a lot of these cases, there's really poor economics, there is just a lot of distrust of their government. But you can look at those three in a row of Georgia, Ukraine, and Kyrgyzstan, and you can see 2003 all the way in with Georgia. By 2007, you're seeing the prison tapes with Saakashvili, and you're seeing up until modern day what's happening in Georgia currently, or in Ukraine in 2004. Take it a decade later in 2014, you're seeing Euromaidan, and then with Kyrgyzstan, just a few 5 years later, you're seeing already a second tulip revolution, and in that case, a very violent one at that as well. In both cases, in 2005 as well as 2010. So even when you have that genuine, want for improvement in your country, there is, as you said, and there's articles about it, there's that genuine support, but as it goes along, that change that you want doesn't necessarily happen, and especially that influence you talked about with, China and Russia. One of the interesting ones that I was noting was in Myanmar, and that it was a 3-part kind of series that they had posted in their Light of Myanmar, which is the state-aligned kind of paper, and it's very specific in its naming, where it's the interference of U.S. and Britain in Myanmar's political affairs, and it kind of goes through a 3-part series. And I'm not saying all the claims in there are accurate, but that shows kind of the perception of some of these other countries and things like that. And as you're going into like the 2020s and late 2010s, you're seeing freezing of open societies accounts, and like you said, those the NED kind of funded organizations and stuff, not allowing to operate in those different countries and things like that. And you're really especially starting to see that in Russia in like the late 2000s, after we see, what happened in Georgia, in Ukraine, and things like that. And I definitely think that the Discord angle is something that's very interesting too, where you can look on, I believe it's the India Times, and they have the messages that you talked about. And I don't want to read them here, but you can go and look for them yourselves and see kind of exactly what violent rhetoric they are using for, calling for overthrows and things like that. And I think it's interesting looking at these revolutions too, of how social media kind of influenced the perceptions and also getting the message across, where when you're looking at things like in Belarus and also in Russia in 2007 and some of the elections there, really using things like Blogspot. And then when you're getting to the late 20 or early 2010s, you're looking at things like Facebook to promote the message, or Twitter and things like that. So I'd be interested to see, what do you think about Discord now, and kind of the influence that that's having on kind of some of these more modern color revolutions, as it were?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's an interesting kind of twofold phenomenon here. So it's like, number one, a very common in the kind of early days of color revolutions post 2000, a very common strategy that was used to trigger protests was the NED and Soros would fund what's known as a parallel vote tabulation, whereby it was supposedly an independent vote count, which would be released in the wake of would be released following official results being published, or indeed in some cases by some accounts before. Now, the PVT's vote tallies differing from official results gave opposition elements the spark required to cry shenanigans, and this was the trigger for NED and sponsored activists, descending on parliament buildings across the former, Soviet sphere in Yugoslavia, for many years thereafter. It's a very common tactic. Now that's I think that's very well known now, and it's not something that people in a lot of the world actually pay very much attention to. I mean, from my own experience, I was actually living in Serbia when something similar to this happened. So in late 2023, there was an election in Serbia, and the opposition, who were heavily tied in with Radio Free Europe and all of these NGOs locally, which are funded by NED and USAID and all of the local embassies, they tried to claim that there'd been fraud and that actually the opposition had won, or they'd done at least better than the official results showed. And the reports that were being shared that were supposedly documenting this fraud, you just look on the About Us section or Our Funders section of these NGOs, and it was this rogues gallery of all of these very well-known color revolution purveyors. People didn't pay attention. So it's like we've gotten to the point now where even if the contents of these reports claiming vote fraud in Serbia were true, people don't pay attention to them anymore because it's like, oh right, well the US is saying this now, is it? It's not of any particular relevance. So I can kind of see that there has been a shift here to more digital strategies, as you mentioned. That's an ever evolving thing. You've got to bear in mind that Instagram and TikTok were also quite central in orchestrating the September 25 Nepal unrest, and so there's that aspect. To it, and I mean, how the interim government was elected is really quite scandalous. I mentioned Nepal is a country of 30 million people, and Hami Nepal, this NED-funded NGO, took it upon themselves to host a vote for the next leader, Nepal's interim leaders, and this was discussed with the military in advance, the people they were going to run. So I mean, there is it's kind of a rather kind of modern digital take on a straight up military coup in many ways. What went down now? Sushila Karki, who is this quite popular local politician prosecutor, who does have some legitimate revolutionary credentials. She was picked by Hami Nepal to be Nepal's kind of interim prime minister, and this was signed off by the military. And then to anoint her, a vote was held on Discord, and she got just under 4,000 votes in a country of 30 million people. I mean, that's like really quite extraordinary. And I thought it was very interesting to me that there was an attempt, even by implication, to suggest that, oh, well, this is how the kids do things and we've got to respect that. That seems to be the narrative in the mainstream media. Although even in reports that kind of endorsed the fact that Discord was used, that quoted, local activists and even local activists and journalists who were supporters of Hami Nepal and the government's overthrow, admitted that it was deeply problematic it had been done in this manner. But I mean, that kind of got lost in all of the kind of psyops branding of this as a spontaneous, quote unquote, Gen Z action, and that Jolly Roger figure, that character from I believe it's a manga, a Japanese manga comic called One Piece. That Jolly Roger logo, it has cropped up at so many different protests around the world. It's now regarded as this kind of universal symbol of resistance by disaffected young people. And in Mexico, when I think, was that around the same time? No, I think that was in November 2025. There were all of these protests in Mexico against Claudia Sheinbaum, who is extremely popular, it must be said, with Mexicans, for whatever that's worth. All of the protesters were waving these flags. So the use of Discord in tandem with that kind of branding, it does kind of give a youth credibility to what are in effect CIA style coups, or even outright military coups, and that's what the media decides to focus on, because it's an image. And we must, again, this is not particularly new. I mean, our dear friends Otpor in Serbia, who subsequently became Canvas and exported their methods of destabilization and resistance around the world. Otpor is Serbian for resistance. They were very focused on communicating via symbols, and they got training from US advertising and PR executives in doing so. And there was a very revealing interview with a senior Otpor activist in 2005 who said they have this kind of, for a time, it was this iconic fist logo, which is a very kind of long-standing revolutionary symbol around the world. It's very common in Palestine solidarity activism, for example. And the senior Otpor leader said, well, our idea was to use corporate branding in politics, and we believe that revolutionary movements need to have a marketing department, and we took Coca-Cola as our model. So I mean, the visual aspect is very, very, very important, in every way, and it does kind of, it helped further this notion that, people have decided to take matters into their own hands. But I mean, at the same time, this is exactly the kind of rhetoric that crops up repeatedly in often euphemistically, but it's very, very clear what they mean in the leaks. They talk about teaching people to take control, to seek positive change. Of course, who decides what the positive change is the local US embassy. And I think in this is a topic I wanted to get into in greater detail in due course. But I think that I've reported on leaks related to in IRI activities in Indonesia, and there is a lot of there are references in the documents to setting targets for the groups and individuals who are part of their who are receiving training from the NED in regime change, basically, and they have all of these different milestones. So an individual activist who's, say, tied to a trade union or a political party or some kind of social movement or NGO will have the personal goal of coming up with a slogan or coming up with a graphic to specifically be used at a protest, and then they get financial rewards if they do well. So it's like it's a very interesting approach where effectively you're giving young people in far-flung countries like Nepal and elsewhere the ability to choose their own revolutionary branding, but at the end of the day they're being paid to do that. And they're specifically at the end of the day being paid to protest. That's like the key thing. And it's a direct continuation of CIA tactics, which are very well established in the wake of World War II. We know in places like West Berlin and other contested parts of Europe that the CIA had a specific budget for funding anti-communist protesters. It was like a budgetary line item. And that's very much the same today, except it's done in a very different way and it's framed very differently.
Yeah, and I think the Hani Nepal, what you're mentioning there, is super similar to what I'm remembering, especially from Otpor, which it's funny kind of how you mentioned, the branding of Coca-Cola, which then when it comes time for Hemi Nepal, they're sponsored by Coca-Cola, so
Yes,
a little bit of
yeah.
like, it's just funny how things work out that way. And especially with that One Piece kind of logo that you talked about, and it really is just about everywhere, right in 2025, when there's like some flooding issues in the Philippines, they're also presenting with that flag. So yeah, very worldwide where it's, and they even reported it in CNN too, as well. All these different news organizations are talking about, why is this flag popping up everywhere and things like that. Not really asking more in depth questions, but just kind of, that's interesting. But yeah, and I think also when you go to the Hemi Nepal website, the very first thing you're met on the about section is just that raised fist right there, kind of bringing it back to Otpor and things like that, in which the Otpor logo is then taken for Georgia, and it's then taken for Oberana in Russia and things like that. So just that logo itself is just, reused over and over again in these different revolutions and things like that. And when you mention the IRI too, just their influence continues to go on, especially throughout all of these revolutions and things like that. I've referred to this French documentary a couple times, but the USA Conquest of the East, I think, really does a great job of capturing some of that, where they are in the IRI offices and then they just have that T-shirt on the wall that has the revolutions that have already happened, and then the ones that are TBD. So Russia, TBD, Belarus, TBD. But it says like Georgia, in 2003, and Ukraine in 2004. And just showing how out in the open these kind of things are, as they're hosting one of the opposition members from Belarus at the time and things like that. And of course, with John McCain being on the chair, I mean, through all these revolutions, you can see it in whether it's like in local papers and things like that. I mentioned this where in the Ukraine Weekly, after one of the rounds of elections in 2004, he writes in there from his office saying, this isn't good for democracy, which just think about it from, any other perspective. If someone from Madagascar, were to write into the New York Times and say, that election in the U.S. wasn't very good for democracy and things like that, there would be some serious questions, which is just very interesting that it's just kind of left there. And, when it came time for Myanmar in 2007, John McCain says, we need to put every sanction we can think of on the country, which of course is not going to impact, the people who are in charge. It's going to impact your civilians and things like that, and make the country a lot poorer, which already it's struggling with the economy to begin with, So it's just interesting seeing how some of these revolutions are almost like a continuing story, where it's building on the methods that were used in the prior years and things like that. And another one I'm kind of interested in is in Macedonia, which I know we call it the colorful revolution, and also kind of like the role that some wiretaps played in that, and which kind of harkens back to some of the Kuchma tapes and that controversy in Ukraine, at the start of the 2000s. What would you say is kind of like the impact of some of those wiretaps and just kind of the overall story in Macedonia?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a very broad question. I mean, it's something I've come back to this I've come back to this topic several times because I think it's like endlessly fascinating, and it's a very, very palpable demonstration of the ravaging impact of color revolution. So just as a bit of background, Macedonia was for a long time part of Yugoslavia. In the wake of Yugoslavia's dissolution in 1991, it becomes an independent state. But there is a significant effort to infiltrate it by the British and the Americans and the Germans, and get the country into the EU and NATO. Now, in order to get the country into NATO, this required really shockingly, actually, changing the country's name to North Macedonia, which the overwhelming majority of the population would not tolerate under any circumstances. It's kind of cultural, historical erasure, and it is that requirement is because Greece, which is obviously very closely a British and American ally, claims the name Macedonia for its own territory, and I would say quite legitimately from the perspective of the people who live in Macedonia, that is not a claim based in anything like reality or history or truth. But I mean that's a conversation that we could go on for many hours about. But the reality is that in the mid 2010s, the country was led by this individual called Nikola Gruevski, who he styled himself as a nationalist and and a patriot, and he was very, very anti any suggestion of the country's name being changed, particularly against the wishes of its population. And so there was a colourful revolution was put into play in order to get rid of him. And there were many different angles to this. MI6 was heavily involved. There was the CIA was heavily involved. The EU was overtly involved, as were USAID and NED, of course. And the colourful revolution people were, again, they were extremely violent. And again, tried to set government buildings on fire, including when there were people in them. Which is quite a shocking thing to do, but they were presented in the media as these these warriors for progress and decency. And what triggered the protest was the release from February 2015 onwards by the opposition party, which was called SDSM. They began regularly releasing what they called bombs, and these were deeply damaging wiretaps of private conversations between Macedonian officials, business people, journalists, and judges. And they seemed to implicate the subjects in very serious crimes, including murder and all sorts of other nefarious violent activities. And this was the kind of rallying call for the colourful revolution protests, which were pretty much instantly extremely violent. Police were attacked, etc. It was only many years later that it was revealed that these recordings had been deceptively edited to completely distort their contents and falsely incriminate government officials. And I think that probably one of the worst examples was there was one bomb, which they called them bombs. One recording that was doctored to make it sound like VMRO leaders had conspired to cover up the murder of a young Macedonian by a senior police officer, and attempts by VMRO to insulate the murderer from justice. In reality, the actual recording showed that the officials were absolutely shocked by the killing and wanted the perpetrator to be severely punished. So it was like the complete opposite of what happened. But I mean, that as I say, it took a few years. It was like 4 or 5 years before the truth was actually known, and the contents of these tapes were sufficient for the EU and US to make declarations that the rule of law has collapsed in Macedonia, and they broke an agreement was broken whereby Gruevski resigned, and new elections were scheduled for I think to happen in 2016. Really interesting aspect of this was that under the terms of this agreement, whereby Gruevski resigned and Macedonia was put on the path to having its name illegitimately changed and the nation of Macedonia effectively being erased in the process, was that what was called a special prosecutor's office was created to investigate officials for very serious crimes that were revealed by the illegal wiretaps. And there was this previously unknown legal apparatchik from a small border town. And when I say small in Macedonian terms, I'm talking like had a tiny population, she was, for reasons unclear, and there is a lot of speculation why she was selected to run the prosecutor's office. And she was this absolute media darling. There were reports calling her Macedonia's Beyonce in the Financial Times, of all places. The BBC called her and her 2 female primary assistants the real-life Charlie's Angels, who were the heroines of the street protests rocking Macedonia. There was even a USAID-funded documentary about Katika Yaneva. In reality, on top of the fact that the recordings were completely bogus and people were being fitted up and jailed for crimes they didn't commit, and other gross abuses of power, Yaneva was lining her pockets to an absolutely obscene degree, and she was effectively blackmailing people, saying she would use the recordings to entrap and blackmail wealthy local business people and say, if you give me a cut of your profits, or if you donate to this charity, then I can make your legal problems go away. Now, I mean, of course, most references to the fact that she was snapping selfies with the British ambassador, etc. That was all scrubbed from the internet, of course. When she got busted, for this. But I think that's something that the kind of lawfare aspect to colourful revolutions. I think that's potentially something that's potentially a strategy that people need to look at more in the context of Western-sponsored regime change efforts abroad, because right around the time that Macedonia was falling victim to this, there was a similar connivance being run in Brazil called Lava Jato. Now, again, I mean, we could do an entire program about that, and it's something that I've written about. I would certainly not say that I was an expert, but from 2014 onwards in Brazil, there was this. Lava Jato means car wash. So there was this federal task force that was created to prosecute senior politicians and business leaders and other prominent figures within Brazilian society, Brazilian politics, for very serious crimes. And it got universally fawning Western media coverage. All sorts of NGOs like Transparency International were cheering what they were doing. The judge overseeing it was named by Time magazine as one of the most important figures in the world. I think that year, and there was a huge media operation behind this, like really selling Lava Jato as like this revolution occurring in Brazil. It was a CIA and FBI lawfare operation, which resulted in enormous amounts of economic damage being inflicted on Brazil because companies were falsely implicated in corruption. But it also led to politicians being jailed on bogus charges, and it was specifically conducted to prevent certain parties from performing well in elections, or certain candidates from even running. And one of the Lava Jato prosecutors in subsequently unearthed, subsequently leaked Telegram chats referred to the indictment of Lula, who is now Brazil's president, as a gift from the CIA, and he spent several years in prison on just completely farcical charges. But it's important to note that throughout the Balkans, and I'm sure that it's the same in many other regions in the world, that the British and the Americans specifically focus on training lawyers. And on top of funding, media operations, like lawfare can feed into so many different, regime change outputs, as I've just described, and the Balkans is a very key focus for that. And I remember when I started writing about Lava Jato many years ago, I could envisage something like that happening in the Balkans. Little did I know it already had done in the form of the Special Prosecutor's Office in Macedonia. But I think that it was devastatingly effective. Ruined lives, wrongfully indicted people ended up committing suicide. Wrongly indicted people were made subject of national mockery in the media for their supposed crimes, which they didn't actually commit. And it was very effective in furthering this narrative that it's the people versus corrupt elites, when it was anything but. And I think that there is a wider push by the intelligence services and also the organisations like the NED to try and fund and influence seemingly neutral, objective public bodies. MI6 for many years has sought to infiltrate and subvert the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and that resulted in the OPCW finding numerous opposition-staged chemical weapons attacks in Syria to be the work of the government. The IAEA, that's been infiltrated by the British too, and the British were instrumental in the IAEA concluding and announcing publicly that Iran had nuclear ambitions when it didn't. So this is what could be better than having a local prosecutor who is presented as a hero and in the mainstream, playing on all of these tropes, similar to All the President's Men, or what's that film with Russell Crowe? Is it The Whistleblower? There is a very well established trope of The Insider with Russell Crowe. There's this very well established trope of the crusading journalist or the crusading lawyer who takes down the government, and like the BBC said, they're the real life Charlie's Angels, when actually they're a bunch of, they certainly look like they're on drugs in that USA documentary, and they were making enormous amounts of money ruining people's lives in service of bringing Macedonia to heel.
Yeah, I think you touched on something really important there too, of like the media influence in how some of these perceptions are shaped and things like that. I know when Serbia and one of the creators of Otpor, they had their own video game that was established, The Force More Powerful, of like, hey, how can we do this? And there's a sequel to it, and I'm blanking on the name of it right now. I think it's maybe People Power Party, I believe. And you can tell there are campaigns in it. You look at the description and go, this sounds a lot like Serbia in 2000. And it's telling you, oh, there's this guy, we have to take him out some way. And it tells you like, oh, here's where you can go do a protest, and here's where you can go do a nonviolent action and things like that, and how you can recruit people, and there even is like that character web where you're talking to these certain people and things like that, which kind of just shows how the influence and things like that seeps into some of these revolutions and things like that. And definitely when you were talking about the OPCW, highly recommend looking at Aaron's recent work on that for the Gray Zone, especially in relation to Syria. He's been really on top of that story and doing great journalism there. And one of the people that you mentioned in Macedonia, especially in the article, was Charles Garrett, who then, I believe, went to Kyrgyzstan after the fact. And which brings us to Kyrgyzstan, which I think is a really interesting kind of revolution, especially coming off of Georgia and Ukraine, where it seems like there are similarities, but also like the dynamics of it are a little bit changed, where we're looking at the air base that opened up and then the Russian air base that opened up nearby as well, and just general kind of that regional positioning, making it feel like a little bit different from the Georgia and Ukraine. Would you say it's like a pattern, or would you say it's more like a hybrid kind of in the case of Ukraine, or excuse me, in the case of Kyrgyzstan in 2005?
Yeah, well, just as a bit of background, I think that's there was something that again really opened my eyes when I was writing about Macedonia. Was I had numerous conversations with people who'd been involved in the Colourful Revolution, and they who told me the exact same story. Was that they worked for some kind of campaign group or NGO that Charles Garrett, the British ambassador, had visited and given money to with the explicit instructions to cause havoc. Now, when I started looking into Garrett, the first thing that catches my eye is that he's posted to Kyrgyzstan after serving in Macedonia for I think it was like 5 years, and then within 6 months there's a colour revolution there too, which was quite violent and resulted in the president being physically removed from office by the military, and that was ignited by reports of vote rigging in the October 2020 election, and then subsequently recordings of Garrett along with US State Department representatives meeting with local journalists and bloggers, offering them enormous sums to identify electoral violations, including vote rigging, and offering them money and top-of-the-range broadcasting equipment to increase their reach. I think, that just really, kind of made me stand up and really think about what the hell Britain's been up to all over Central Asia. But Kyrgyzstan is very, very. I think the 2005 Tulip Revolution. I felt kind of motivated to write about it because it's one of the more forgotten color revolutions, and I think that it's particularly notable from that perspective because the impact it had was absolutely massive in terms of turning Kyrgyzstan, which was by most metrics the freest and most stable kind of post-Soviet Central Asian republic country. And it had a pretty open media. It was very, very overrun by NGOs. Very, very foolish. Akayev, who was the president, he referred to Kyrgyzstan as the land of NGOs, as as the Netherlands is the land of tulip. It was rather eerily prescient, given how he fell from power, and indeed the title of the color that was given to that color revolution. But what really stands out about it was the fact that Akayev was not only very popular locally, like organically, and was not elected via rigging or corruption or whatnot. He was fundamentally a Democrat who avowedly followed the teachings of Adam Smith, not Karl Marx. But he was very, very, very pro-Western, and he allowed a significant degree of US penetration of the country from 1991 onwards, and I think that really that was capped off by allowing the US to construct this vast military base in Kyrgyzstan the Manas military base, which was, it was quite shocking at the time that the US was pushing into Central Asia, and it's Manas is now one of several bases which has basically been abandoned by the US because they're not particularly interested in the region from that perspective anymore, in terms of supporting active US military operations in Afghanistan and elsewhere. But Kyrgyzstan's also interesting to me because it seems like it seems like a move that was conducted because the US was drunk on power. Like they felt that they could just do this and get away with it without any pushback without serious pushback from the Russians or other or let alone the target countries in question. And this is something I've cited in a lot of my writing, is that in 2005, the same year as the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan, USA publishes this very slick, glossy magazine called Democracy Rising, which has all of these really quite extraordinary quotes in it from various different individuals or organizations that were involved in the color revolutions, including an activist in Georgia who said that we couldn't have carried out the Rose Revolution without US help, etc. And I think that the US became intensely relaxed about advertising the fact that they were doing this, because it was, the US is pro-democracy and they're spreading freedom, around the world. It became part of their own marketing and branding. But also, it was a demonstration of such was US power at that time, that if governments, even if they were pro-Western and to all intents and purposes puppets, if they stepped 1 foot out of line, the US could destabilize and overthrow them. And I think, in Shevardnadze in Georgia was another example of this. He was very, very, very pro-Western from 1991 onwards, and it was only in 2003 when he tried to start mending fences with Russia, because they'd been rather hostile to one another throughout the 1990s, and there was the prospect of Russia gaining access to Georgia's vast energy reserves. That's when it was decided to get rid of him, and in February that year, that's when Soros begins pumping vast sums of money into openly insurrectionary projects in Georgia, using the kind of the open door that Shevardnadze provided in the first place for this huge surging growth of NGOs locally. That again, signed his own death warrant, and the same is true. The same is true of Akayev too. But at that time, inviting Russia to open a base not far actually from Manas was considered beyond the pale. And the US was in a position to to punish governments for stepping out of line. And that message was was clearly very, very well received by governments throughout the region. It's like, we need to play ball, otherwise we're going to be in very serious trouble, and these assets exist to get rid of us. And I also think Kyrgyzstan in 2005 is important it's important to study, because yes, I'm sure that Kyrgyzstan wasn't perfect, and that there were a certain number of people within the country who had grievances, who wanted something different and quote unquote better. But the fact of the matter is that there was no rigging that could be identified, or funny business, real or otherwise, around the election. It was praised by international observers for being, in 2005, praised for being fair and open, and the opposition was not subject to intimidation, let alone suppression or anything, and the government won in a fair contest. And then immediately you have often armed NED-sponsored protesters take to the streets and start violently clashing with police. There were bomb attacks on police stations, and there's a New York Times report from the time which inadvertently acknowledges that there are the US funded TV stations were pretty much directly inspiring violence in certain areas of Kyrgyzstan, and it was so bloody and brutal that the UN Secretary General at the time, Kofi Annan, explicitly expressed alarm over the use of violence and intimidation. So it's like there was nothing organic about it. It was completely violent from the word go, and yet it succeeded. And again, the US kind of got away with it. But I would suggest that perhaps the fact that these protesters were engaging in violent clashes without any provocation or any seeming rationale beyond they wanted to overthrow the government because reasons. I think that may well have influenced thinking in terms of later regime change strategies, that there does need to be some violence meted out to protesters to justify violent counterattacks from Western assets in country. And William van Wagenen, who is this excellent independent journalist, he wrote a very long and well worth reading essay on for the Libertarian Institute on the use of false flag snipers in the Arab Spring. And most Arab Spring uprisings, at least funnily enough the successful ones, the unsuccessful ones in Western puppet states like Bahrain, which were very where the governments were actually very brutal towards protesters, didn't get any media attention. What did get media attention was the supposed the massacre by sniper fire of supposedly peaceful protesters by government forces in countries like Tunisia, and that directly led to the Tunisian government's downfall. In Syria, in 2011, there were snipers who were shooting peaceful protesters at a time that the government was issuing very clear instructions to security forces to not harm protesters. And there are some leaked Syrian government files in which it's discussed, the prospect of capturing one of these snipers and parading them around on TV is discussed, because they understood that it was very problematic and it was creating atrocity propaganda that was going to be used to justify destabilization, overthrow, invasion, bombing campaigns, etc. So the Syrian government were wise to it, but they didn't really know what to do. So I think that Kyrgyzstan demonstrated that there needs to be some kind of justification for the unrest, because there wasn't dubious activity around the voting process. They weren't going up against a brutal dictator who deployed lethal force against protesters. It was a popular and fairly elected leader who, in any event, Akayev had said he was going to stand down within a few months of the election, and there was no reason to believe that he wouldn't. Perhaps the experience kind of solidified the notion that, we do need some violence of some kind directed towards protesters to justify violent unrest. And I think that that in itself has been a component dating back as far as Tiananmen Square. There is a student leader, one of the leader of student protesters who was central to the occupation of Tiananmen Square. Like, she admitted at the time, that our strategy is to provoke the state into inflicting bloodshed and to butcher people, and only when the square is awash with blood will the Chinese open their eyes and rise up against their rulers. So I think that all of this stuff is like constantly evolving, and lessons are obviously learned from what works, what doesn't, what can be made better, what techniques and strategies should we stick by. And I think that it is interesting as well that the Tulip Revolution was not presaged by violence by the state, and then yet it brought to power the brutal rule of this Western dictator called Bakayev, who personally enriched himself from the local U.S. military presence, but then had to flee the country in 2010, just 5 years after the Tulip Revolution, where following mass protests where local security forces had used lethal force and shot hundreds of people and wounded, shot hundreds of people dead and wounded hundreds more. And again, in the spirit of these things, when Bakayev became Kyrgyzstan's leader, he was celebrated as a democrat and a reformer in the Western media, when he wasn't. It was actually considerably more repressive than Akayev.
Yeah, I think I find it one of the more interesting revolutions, honestly, because kind of what you picked on is that it's something that's very different from some of the other ones. I will mention that Democracy Rising one that you mentioned, I was like, wow, this makes my job very easy. I'm able to pull out these direct quotes and these direct funding mechanisms and things like that. So I was like, hey, I appreciate that. You made that a lot easier for me. But yeah, kind of as you said, it's a little bit of that hubris kind of angle too, where you can read about it, where they initially opened up that airbase exactly for, in terms of the war on terror in Afghanistan. And then the leash just kept getting extended and extended and extended. And then also you can see this in both like the Wall Street Journal and also that USA Conquest of the East documentary, where they have the guy working from Freedom House who's printing out on the printing press some of the opposition papers and things like that, Mike Stone. And in the documentary, he even says like, hey, what do you think that Vladimir Putin's going to think about this? And he quite literally says, I don't give a damn, what his perception is and things like that. And I think too, in Kyrgyzstan, it's very interesting. There is something that I don't know that I've seen in some of the other revolutions, where we have the youth group Kelkel, and there actually ended up being clone Kelkel, which was like the state-aligned Kelkel, where they actually got the internet domain for Kelkel, and then they were just writing stuff on there like down with the regime and things like that, and kind of promoting the state-aligned framing for it and things like that. And I still want to know if this actually happened or if this was just written on there, but they had also talked about it being like a lemon revolution. And so on one of them, they said that one of the events that, and this is when the state-aligned Kelkel was in charge of the website, they said that they're going to nursing homes and giving out lemons. And so I just want to imagine that that's a real thing, because that sounds very humorous to me. But another thing that I think is really important to mention is kind of what you said with the perceptions of how they change over times. And especially when you look at Georgia, that happens quite a few times, where there are these articles where Soros is meeting with Shevardnadze in the early 1990s. John McCain calls him one of the great men in the history of the world, and then a few short years later, when the Rose Revolution does happen, those perceptions get flipped, very quickly. Or even just look at it through some of their local media. There's that cartoon called Dardu Bala, which came out, and there was the initial one, which was on Rustavi 2, the U.S. kind of funded channel. And then it was always parodying Shevardnadze. And then right after the Rose Revolution happens, it quickly changes. And now in the role that Shevardnadze played, it's Saakashvili, So in just a few short years, those perceptions can be changed very quickly and things like that. And that influence kind of continued up until, as you mentioned, in 2010, when they had the second kind of Tulip Revolution. They also had a cartoon in there, and you can see, I believe it's on their Facebook page, where there's the cartoon. It's like one of those posters for it. And then right in the bottom left corner is USAID, just right there, that logo kind of showing how these funding mechanisms kind of work, which I think brings us to Serbia, which in my opinion kind of is the first real big go at it, as it were. The Washington Post saying, around 41 million was spent here, and also the role of like Otpor and Canvas. And how would you say that those are kind of showing up today, whether it be in Nepal, whether it be in Macedonia? Do you think that they have kind of like evolved since that time of Otpor and Canvas, or how do you think that's kind of changed in the roughly 26 years since the bulldozer revolution?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Canvas are. they are a deeply nasty fraternity. And I think that you mentioned earlier, I didn't know they'd made 2 video games. I know that they made one that you mentioned that was what was it called? Sorry, what was it?
It was
Force More Powerful. Yeah. No, I remember finding out about that, and it's just like it was the kind of thing I just had to commit to. So I had to commit to my investigation into the Rose Revolution, because it's just like, it's absolutely extraordinary. And it's like, there are leaked Stratfor is this private intelligence firm. These leaked Stratfor emails that talk about how Canvas is secretly receives US funding, and is, when deployed properly, is more damaging than a US aircraft carrier. And I mean, they seem to be a laboratory for regime change strategies, old and new, and it's something that they're exporting around the world. And again, it's a kind of constant process of refinement, what works, what doesn't, etc. Although, I mean, it's interesting that this continued US funding for their operations is hidden. I mean, bearing in mind that Serge Popovich, who was the Canvas founder, I mean, he had Stratfor apparatchiks present at his wedding in Belgrade, which shows the deep and coherent handshake between Oppo then and Canvas now, and the CIA. That it still endures. But at the same time, I think that the fact that this stuff is done publicly. I mean, as we well know, that senior NED officials have openly stated, we do publicly what the CIA used to do covertly. But I mean, something that I have written about that I found quite an interesting data point that went rather unnoticed is the NED's been very much forced underground, actually, kind of defeating its its initial its kind of founding purpose. It used to have a grant database where people could search for what NED was funding, what was being supported in different parts of the world. Now, I mean, that was by no means exhaustive or complete. There were problems with it, but it meant that concerned citizens and independent journalists could, whenever there was, it was a kind of fun party trick that I used to do, where whenever, not literally, but whenever there was a protest anywhere in the world, look at who's being quoted and look at the organisations that are reported as being at the forefront of it. Check the NED grant database, and 9 times out of 10 they're listed. Being paid specifically to do what they're being reported as doing, stirring up anti-government unrest one way or another. And I mean, I think that the fact that this stuff got taken offline, it shows that there is a huge amount of stigma associated with overt US funding. There is a 1991 Washington Post report that said that covert funding would have been the kiss of death for civil society organizations if it was done by the CIA. Overt funding is the kiss of life. Well, again, that calculus has changed very, very radically. And it's like, I mean, were it not for the leaks that we at the Grey Zone have reported on, nobody would know that Hami Nepal was an NED asset at all. I mean, there are certain traces that you can detect if you know what to look for, but a lot of people don't know what to look for. Hence, some people seem to have fallen for it. But there does seem to be a push in recent years for things to go underground to an extent. And yes, I mean, Canvas was operating for many years without its US funding. How much was being given to it and by whom or what within the US power structure? That's not something that Canvas talks about publicly and openly. And they have a stock no doubt strategically planned out response, which is, well, the funding has to come from somewhere if they're ever asked about it. But that is very problematic, and it's not something that I think that may have been behind one of the reasons that behind USAID shutdown, is that brand is now completely tainted, just purely based on on what's known publicly and open source records about what US aid actually is and what it actually does. It doesn't have the same capabilities as it once did. Now, you mentioned you mentioned John McCain being very openly aligned with the anti-government groups. He was, very much embedded with Zhuba, and which was the Belarusian anti-Lukashenko op clone. And I think that the Belarusian experience of this is quite interesting, because the Belarusian authorities were prepared for exactly what happened in Ukraine to happen in Belarus, and the overt relationship between Zhuba and the George W. Bush administration, to the extent that I think Zhuba's founder got the Presidential Medal of Freedom or something crazy, like given to him personally by George W. That kind of killed them dead out the gate, because for one, it provided a perfectly legitimate reason for Belarusian authorities to prescribe the activities of Zhuba, but also they could inform their population. Well, I mean, look who's standing behind them and what they're being funded to do, which made a large number of average citizens very, very wary of them. I think, were it not for that very public endorsement, then perhaps they could have gotten away with it again in Belarus. But yeah, that shift to things being not quite so public anymore is on top of, I mean, that seems to be ongoing, and it is actually quite problematic, because effectively, weapons are being hidden from the average, from average citizens, and also, governments themselves. So, I mean, even if there is a kind of a public sentiment, against Western funding for civil society, organizations, if that's concealed, then there will be suspicions, but they're just suspicions, and I think that Canvas advertising on its website, it's trained hundreds and hundreds of groups all over the world, on every continent, in scores of countries, but even they are not actually very open about what they're doing. And I think in Georgia, funnily enough, around we mentioned that the Georgian government got into tons of trouble for trying to force foreign-funded organizations to disclose their funding sources. I believe it was in September 2023, so it's going back a while now, that there were members of Canvas's local office in Tbilisi, Georgia, who were summoned for questioning by local security services over what they were up to. So I mean, perhaps the time has come for the empire to pick another kind of cutout or cover for carrying this stuff out. These strategies still do work. But I mean, in terms of a risk, in terms of a risk reward ratio, I think it's getting it is getting more and more dangerous for the US to do this in certain countries. I mean, Russia certainly, but then by the same token, when Russia labels certain organizations, be they media outlets or civil society organizations, as undesirable, well, crackdowns on them can still be framed for domestic propaganda purposes as demonstrations of the totalitarian nature of the Russian government or other kind of enemy states throughout the world. But despite that, I do think that Nepal amply demonstrates that this risk is still very, very, very real, and it's something that a lot of people should be not only wise to, but also be trying to call out as much as possible. Because, like I say, there were people who genuinely believed that the Nepali unrest was completely organic and legitimate and driven by very, very, very real grievances. And I think you're losing. You're basically doing the empire's public relations work for them by dismissing suggestions of a foreign hand behind this stuff, because it's so ingrained now, and it's so wide ranging that you don't know how the particular organizations are can be or will be or are being used to undermine governments. There are WikiLeaks, in the WikiLeaks diplomatic cables, there are references to how disability rights groups in Venezuela were being exploited to try and undermine Chavez. And it's like, well, the average person on the street is A, not going to know that, and B, may think, well, at least life-saving support is being granted when otherwise it wouldn't be. But again, even that, I don't really buy that argument at all. And yeah, it allows potentially hostile, poisonous forces to coagulate at the core of societies, awaiting activation. In the case of Nepal, as I wrote about, the trigger for the colour revolution seems to be what seems to have been attempts by Nepalese authorities to effectively emulate China's Great Firewall, so in order to create their own localized internet assets, or whether that's e-commerce or just general web resources that aren't run by Western corporations or even Western governments. That seems to have been what tipped NED over the edge, as it were, and led to these fiery protests. So yeah, you never know what's going to be exploited and weaponized next, but it's important to be on guard, I think.
Yeah, and definitely the part you mentioned about how a lot of these things have now gone kind of hidden and things like that. During this research process, I've become very intimately recognized with things like Internet Archive, where you have to go and find what the IRI was saying in 2005 or 2006 and like what was on their front page at the time, because now it is kind of operating a little bit more in secret and things like that, where it's not quite as easy to find some of those funding mechanisms and things like that, not put in the Washington Post as it was in the Bolshevik Revolution, or put in the Wall Street Journal in Kyrgyzstan and things like that. I think what you mentioned about the Belarus Revolution is definitely something that's very interesting too, where once again, John McCain is present in this one too, where he's saying that the change in regime is not, by weapons and military action, but instead it's international pressure that's going to, do the job there and things like that. And kind of that relationship you mentioned with Bush too, where he has that kind of famous speech in February 2005, where he's praising some of the revolutions that have already happened. Just hours before that, he's meeting with people and giving them awards and things like that from different initiatives in Belarus and things like that, who were then thanking Bush for his support and things like that. And that youth group too, it has like that very clear lineage to where in 2003, the youth group from Belarus is then hanging out with people wearing the Otpor shirts and stuff, and it's posted on their website for everyone to see as well. The Belarus youth group even has, like, as one of their news articles from around that time was, after Saddam Hussein fell, who's next? Essentially, posing that Belarus is going to be the next to fall, kind of in a Iraq type fashion and things like that. And then, yeah, they're continuing to get awards through like 2004, where they're getting awards and even signatures from members of European Parliament for the Belarus youth group there, which I think is all very interesting and kind of showing, as we've discussed, the influence from some of these foreign international kind of sources for these youth groups and things like that. So I think we talked about this a little bit, but just, kind of as a wrap up here, with us now reaching 2026, are there any regions that we see kind of these dynamics continuing to show up and things like that? I know we've mentioned like Nepal as being one that is kind of still in the process of ongoing and things like that. But is there any other ones that we see where like similar conditions are kind of settling the ground for potential revolutions and things like that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I mentioned Indonesia. I think Indonesia is very interesting to look at, and I wrote something for Mint Press quite a while back now. I believe it was before that. It was around the time of their 2023 general election, because they were choosing a new president. And the Indonesia had been led for a number of years by that point by an individual called Joko Widodo, who was very, very, very popular and had sought to construct an economically and politically sovereign Indonesia. Indonesia, of course, is very rich in resources. It was in the wake of World War II. It was part of the non-aligned movement, and then a very bloody CIA coup, which led to hundreds of thousands being killed, put an end to that, and it was then led by General Suharto for 30 years with an iron fist. So it's Indonesia is, for a variety of reasons, very important geopolitically from the perspective of Western powers. But then when you add in that Widodo was also about he was very big on Palestine solidarity and a united front across the entire Muslim world. Indonesia's the world's biggest Muslim country. It's also a democracy, no matter how flawed you might think it is. It does have multiple political parties. It's got relatively free media, and that it could very easily be a regional, if not international, player in many regards. So Widodo striking out on his own and specifically talking about offering to serve as a bridge between Russia and Ukraine, and urging that the two sides in that conflict to reach an amicable settlement. That probably did not play very well in Washington DC or London or Brussels or other kind of imperial centers of power. Now, I actually have an investigation forthcoming, so I'm kind of giving you the scoop, Patrick. But there are a large, again, the Grey Zone has received a large number of leaks that show that Open Society Foundation's George Soros outfit has been pumping hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, up to in excess of $1 million, which is a lot of money in Indonesia, to promote specifically to promote resistance and dissent against Widodo's chosen successor, who is called Prabowo Subianto, and it explicitly talks about the necessity of either trying to get rid of these leaks specifically refer to the necessity of getting rid of Prabowo before his first term in office is over, and if that fails, then denying him re-election. And the leaks are very, very, very illuminating. They specifically talk about how well we've intensified our activities over time. We have steadily built this civil society resistance, kind of opposition infrastructure, which is just getting stronger and stronger. And they've again been taught to challenge alleged electoral fraud, to hold the government to account if it doesn't pass certain legislation, or if it passes certain legislation, focus on the negatives and the criticisms, and on top of that, IRI runs, like in Nepal, runs youth radicalization programs, future leader programs. It funds protests, and it is very much training people to try and take power via brute force. So I think that that's certainly something to look at. Like, more generally, I think Asia Pacific is an area that's heating up significantly, because while from a kind of practical and physical standpoint, I would say that the Asia pivot in US foreign policy is dead in the water, and I think there is seemingly a growing sense amongst US policymakers that the US lacks the muscle to counter China, quote unquote, through traditional brute force terms. It's still considered very important to surround China with hostile puppet states. And the way that you do that now is not via military invasion, but through color revolutions. I think Brian Beletic has done a lot of very interesting work. I think recently he's touched upon Indonesia, but also the US building these shadow armies in Thailand, in other countries, that at the very least can influence what their governments do along, a kind of anti-China line, or at least, to take stances and adopt policies that one way or another, are hostile to, peaceful coexist and constructive coexistence with China. So I think that's going to be like a key area of focus. And another point that I think is important to make here, and I kind of garbled it earlier, is the fact that the color revolutions and the whole civil society infiltration, it is a massive international business. And I mean, I've lived in the former Yugoslavia for a very long time now, and you've got to understand that in these countries there are many professions where lines of work that if locals want to work in a particular field, or they have a particular passion, then your options are pretty limited to Western funded organizations. I mean, if you want to be a journalist, it's very in this part of the world, your options are Radio Free Europe, or maybe something funded by the British, or something funded by the Americans, which is specifically to undermine elected governments. So people can get shepherded into this very easily. But also the fact is that these people don't know, because the NED was created to carry out coups and infiltrate civil society abroad. Even though their methods have evolved and the kind of people running it have evolved, it's very clear based on leaked emails that we've reported on that there is a huge split within the NED between a newer guard who are very kind of quote unquote woke and very concerned about social justice issues, and the old guard who are pro-Israel, who are more socially conservative, or kind of traditional liberals who don't like this stuff. And we reported on how a long-time NED apparatchik, one of he got fired. He got because he kept on butting heads with these kind of younger social justice warriors at the NED. And one of the reasons that he got fired was he refused to put his pronouns in his email signature, which is like quite extraordinary. But yeah, I mean, they don't know how to do anything else, so they're going to keep doing this one way or another. I mean, whether that works or not is kind of immaterial to whether they're going to try and do it. There are some countries where like I mentioned Serbia, where the same methods and strategies don't work because people are very wise to them, and people reject the claims and also the actions of foreign funded organizations. They don't have that influence anymore. The same is not true in other parts of the world. I think particularly, just from a financial perspective, Southeast Asia remains in many places, compared to the West, extremely poor. And in that context, it is quite easy to recruit local assets. And it is a region of enormous geopolitical significance historically, but also in the present context. So this stuff is just going to continue, and it's as Nepal demonstrates, this stuff remains. These strategies and techniques remain redoubtable. They remain very effective at getting rid of governments when they step out of line, and also they're very good at creating the new generations of political elites who are going to be so co-opted and so corrupted by token of working for directly or indirectly for NED or the IRI or the NDI, that they're not going to make much trouble in office, and they're not going to cause very many problems. So to bring this full circle, I mentioned how in Nepal the individuals who were at the forefront of the violence and the organizations that were at the forefront of the violence, they now comprise the country's government. And the likelihood that they're going to step out of line when they have committed very serious crimes to get into power is extremely low. And I mentioned that there was an official inquiry that was instituted by the interim government in Nepal into the circumstances of the September 2025 coup, which found that numerous people who comprised the new government either committed very serious crimes or indeed lied to the commission. And claim, for instance, Balan Shah, the rapper turned prime minister, who was the mayor of Kathmandu at the time, he claimed that, oh well, we dispatched fire engines in a prompt, standard manner to extinguish these blazes that set by protesters. But then the report notes that this wasn't true. So it's like, in that context, when the US can hold this over you, are you going to step out of line and cause very many problems, given that the second that you're out of office, you're going to jail? Probably not. And it's like the same story, plays out. I think, and there's another aspect, is another, I think, region to look at. Is actually, funnily enough, again bringing things full circle, like the Central and Eastern Europe, where the color revolutions were honed and where they were deployed with tremendous effect, because in most cases these revolutions, or proto-color revolutions, such as in Slovakia in 1997, because they created lots of misery and they resulted in the construction of political and economic systems that don't operate in the interests of local people and are actively opposed by an ever-growing proportion of the population. I think that's another area that's an area which is going to become of interest again. I've again had something forthcoming for my website on this, but in the past 18 months, there have been numerous examples of governments that have been taken down via direct and indirect interference, whether that's typically by the EU now, but also to a smaller extent the US. Orban in Hungary, he had a vast internal opposition infrastructure that was foreign funded, that was undermining him and coordinating directly with the EU and in the US, and he's just lost an election to an upstart outsider who very much seems to have been handpicked and groomed by someone for power, not heard of before the start of 2024, and now he's Hungary's prime minister. He has no history of political activism whatsoever, and he's taking directions from Western funded NGOs on what Orban era legislation to scrap and what reforms, quote unquote, to adopt. This followed the overturning of an election in Romania because the wrong person won. There were claims of Russian meddling to justify the invalidation of the vote, and the EU is openly talking about taking measures to undermine the governments of Slovakia and Serbia, which are at least putatively, if not always in practice, pro-Russia, pro-China, and not signed up to the Western NATO agenda in all, at least in all matters. So that's another kind of flashpoint. I think it's like it's a great thing indeed that you're producing this fantastic series on color revolutions, because a lot of people should know about this stuff, and not least the fact that it used to be so open and blatant. Not so much anymore. And I think the contrast that I always cite in talking about this kind of paradigm shift is in 2004, in the wake of the Orange Revolution in Kiev, that was we know was orchestrated by NED, was admitted to have been orchestrated by the NED. In late 2004, the Guardian produced this extraordinary report that basically that explicitly stated that there was that went into great detail about how USAID and NED had worked to prevent Viktor Yanukovycz's victory, and they use remarkable phraseology such as, well, the US has fine-tuned the strategy for winning other people's elections, and it talks about how these methods have matured over time. So that's the Guardian in late 2004, reporting factual reporting on and with an almost kind of boastful tone to it about how the US is helping battle corruption and take down, quote unquote, unsavory regimes. You fast forward to Russia, as I mentioned, banning NED in 2015, and the Guardian used a quote taken from NED's website to describe what it did. There is a huge kind of retroactive cover-up ongoing, where the media not only doesn't talk about the role of the West in whipping up these insurrections, but not only that, but like actively denies it. I mean, there's the Maidan coup, which is just I've written about, and many other people have written about, which is this absolutely blatant NED putsch, where the person who started the protests in the first place was a long time NED US aid asset locally, who the year prior had met John McCain on a State Department funded trip to the US and discussed the threat of Russia to Ukraine. That most organizations at the forefront of the unrest were in receipt of NED or USAID funding. There were media assets specifically set up to cover the protests, like Hromadski, that was in purely funded, purely foreign funded, and its purpose was to produce dramatic footage of mass protests, which was then fed to the Western media. And you can find reports from the time by mainstream outlets and many articles in the New York Times elsewhere in the wake of the Ukraine proxy war erupting in February 2022 that aggressively rebut and condemn any suggestion that this was anything other than organic and universally popular, was just demonstrably untrue. So there is a battle for the truth that's not only the present but the past, which is ever ongoing. So I think talking about this stuff and giving people the fundamentals to track and expose it is very important.
Yeah, and kind of picking on one part that you mentioned about how in certain parts of the country where if you want to produce journalism and things like that, I set up a LinkedIn page for for my Substack and things like that, mostly so I can just talk to people who are on the ground, who are part of these revolutions and things like that. And you should see the job offerings. It's Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, and all these types of things. And it's like, hey, I'm not getting the funding like that, but I'm okay with that because I want to present the truth, that I know it and things like that. So, well, yeah, this has been an excellent conversation, Kit. And if people have not followed Kit's work, you absolutely should. Not only the Color Revolutions, he has an awesome article about 9/11 from a few years ago. That was a really bombshell report. But just excellent articles. If they're not following you, where could they go and follow you, as well as your excellent episodes of Decline and Fall as well?
Oh yeah, thank you very much, Patrick. Yeah, I was about to say, you can find me on Twitter. That's just Kit Klarenberg, imaginatively, and then I have my own website, Global Delinquents, which is www.kitklarenberg.com. I would also, urge you to check out my podcast. It's not quite as good as Patrick's, but it's still pretty good. It's called Decline and Fall, and we talk about matters like this and and related. So maybe see you there. But yeah, thanks so much for having me on. I really enjoyed this.
Absolutely. All right.